Welcome, everyone. My name is Michael Gold. I'm the Associate Director in the Center for Agroforestry here at the University of Missouri. And I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Rose Hayden Smith for her presentation today. Rose is an Emeritus University of California Cooperative Extension Advisor. She has an MA and a PhD in History and Public Historical Studies, an MA in Education, a BA in English, all from UC Santa Barbara. She is a busy person, author, digital strategist, historian, food system specialist, and coach. Currently a digital education specialist for the Extension Foundation and emeritus with University of California Ag and Natural Resources. She's a former Kellogg Foundation Fellow. She served as a strategic initiative leader in sustainable food systems for University of California Ag and Nat Resources, recently recognized for her work promoting sustainability in the food system by UC Davis, receiving the Bradford Rominger Award. And now in her retirement, which is not retirement, she's working again in the Extension Foundation, focused on technology and extension education and digital engagement strategy. And her presentation today will be Reimagining Victory Gardens for a New Era, Cultivating Possibility in a Time of Pandemic. And delighted to welcome you, Rose.
Well, good morning, and thank you so much for having me today. I am so thrilled to be with you all. And I live in, like all of you, I'm working out of home. I live in a very noisy urban neighborhood, very close to a level 2 trauma center. So if a helicopter comes by, I will mute for a second and pause, but I haven't gone away. Okay, so my presentation today is about sort of reimagining the notion of victory gardens during the pandemic. So let's see. Here we go. Cultivating possibility. You know, what are we going to do with this time right now? So, where we find ourselves? Well, I think a lot of us find ourselves at home. We find ourselves in a sort of a time of crisis, and I would say cascading crises, right? We've not only got this pandemic, but the pandemic has really revealed to so many people the sort of state of perpetual crisis that so many people, so many in the United States and around the world live in who are being impacted by environmental crises, who are dealing with inadequate housing, inadequate food, inadequate medical care, the economic disparities, just this really interesting time. So I'm a historian, and kind of interestingly, one of my areas of focus is the period around World War One, and so in my historical work, I do look at the pandemic, the influenza pandemic, a little bit, and I do think that there are many similarities between World War One and that period and where we are now. They were dealing with a global pandemic with no sort of good medical therapeutics, just like we are now. It was a period that there was a lot of social response to the incredible disparities. And I'll be talking about, the context within the US, coming off sort of that Gilded Age, the age of the robber barons. And so, with all the things that were going on in very chaotic social times, there was a lot of labor unrest, there was a lot of racial unrest. Women struggling to earn the right to vote. And again, economic disparity. And so you have within that period America entering a war and this really interesting national effort on many different fronts to turn to gardening in schools, at home, in communities, in workplaces as a response to the chaos and the challenges that the nation faced. So, I'm going to give you a little history about the run up to World War One. And throughout the presentation, I've included some poster art because one of the areas of study in my doctoral program was art history. And so I chose to focus on war posters. So I want you to take a look really quickly at this poster. It's a World War One poster. The Spirit of 18, the World Cry Food. Keep the home garden going. And I'm sure that you recognize that poster. It's actually a re-depiction of a very famous painting called The Spirit of 76. And instead of carrying muskets and marching into battle against the British, these Americans are rebelling and instead gardening, right? So some of the history before World War One, obviously we had a tradition of kitchen gardens, which were really important in America and elsewhere, and in the United States. Sometimes kitchen gardens were really critical for women in terms of giving them access to markets to sell their products. We also had an interesting thing in this country in 1893 that was an economic downturn called the Panic of 1893. And the urban areas were really hard hit, factories shut down. There were not the social safety nets that we have now. There weren't, supplemental nutrition assistance program. There wasn't unemployment insurance, and really sort of charity was mostly centered around churches and things like that. But there was a really terrific, interesting mayor in Detroit named Hazen Pingree. And he looked around, he was very concerned about how people were suffering and about the potential for civil unrest. And he and his team of advisors came up with a model, potato patch gardens, urban farms. And they worked with factory owners and they made land available, they provided resources, there was training available. And this sort of relief gardening in cities really took off. And by 1896, there was actually a National Vacant Lot Cultivation Association. And I think 16 major cities across the nation were involved and had chapters. So this urban agriculture, is not a new thing in the United States. And gardening as sort of a relief method is not new. There was the whole larger thing of progressivism, right? Just sort of reform and changing. And I would argue that we're perhaps going to go into sort of a new progressive era with this change in administration and probably some sort of course correction for the excesses of the last, probably several decades. So there were other impulses driving this victory garden movement in the United States. There was the school garden movement. School gardens were a huge deal, not only in the US, but internationally at the turn of the last century. And there were so many books about garden education, agriculture education for youth that were produced around the turn of the century and into the teens. There was also the City Beautiful movement, which wasn't just the sort of Frederick Law Olmsted idea of beautiful landscapes, but the way that landscapes could uplift, um, you know, uh, communities and sort of what progressive era reformers would have seen as moral uplift. There was the Country Life Commission created by Teddy Roosevelt, and I know a lot of you know about this, which was really looking at the tensions between urban and rural, because the tensions between urban and rural that we experience right now, red states, blue states, those have been present in American life for a really long time. There was also increasing urbanization in the US that sort of fueled these gardening movements. And the 1920 census is the first census in the US history where we had a majority of Americans who were living in urban or suburban areas. Immigration, tension around immigration, and this period is probably the period in America where we have one of the highest percentages of immigrants in the country. There was also the sort of continuum, the infrastructure in terms of science and research and organizational infrastructure that was being reflected in Smith-Lever, which was passed in 1914, and the sort of continuum by federal legislation like the Morrill Land Grant Act, the Hatch Act, the 1890 institutions, things like that, Second Morrill, the professionalization of science and opportunities for women to claim fields in science like nutrition science. There was also the suffrage movement, and you'll learn in a few minutes about how the suffrage movement actually played a significant role in home front mobilization around food production in World War I. And there was also a national leadership that of influential people that were very concerned about the fact that they didn't think children understood where their food came from, which is something that many of us would still be concerned about right now. And among that national leadership, people like Luther Burbank and a man named Charles Lathrop Pack, who was a forester and a philanthropist, and who was one of the sort of really significant people behind the Victory Guard movement in World War I. So United States enters the war, and we come to the war very late compared to the European allies, several years, and we are really needed to provide food. And so we've got this food will win the war, and that is what Woodrow Wilson told Congress when he declared war on Germany. So you've got this poster here, Uncle Sam Says Garden to cut food cost. And I want you to look at the background. It's a little hard to see, it's kind of pixelated. But if you look at the background, you'll see that it's like an American flag. It's in the shape of an American flag that they're cultivating. And so part of this, the message of this, was that gardening could be a unifying activity for a nation that was really at odds with itself and with its position in the world and at odds with one another. People in America were not 100% on board with going to war. There had been, a lot of people who wanted to remain neutral. So gardening was seen as sort of a unifying activity. So the the effort in World War I was not entirely driven by the government. It wasn't really a government effort, although the government was part of the movement. It was sort of more of a grassroots movement with government involvement and a lot of organizations that were involved, like the YMCA, which was actually not the YMCA at that point, the Red Cross, gardening groups, but there were national agencies and bureaus that were involved. And it was a series of linked national programs promoting school, home, community, and workplace gardens. And one of the angles that the proponents of these programs stressed was that it was essential to national security. And that's something that's really prevalent in the literature around these efforts in World War I, is that it's essential to national security. So you had a general Victory Garden, Liberty Garden program that was targeted very, very broadly, but they also did some sub branding and sub messaging very interestingly to immigrant groups, and they published literature and posters in many different languages. It was multicultural. There was a specific program that's the one I find just absolutely fascinating, which was called the United States School Garden Army. And it was the first sort of softly mandated federal curriculum encouraging garden-based education in schools for youth, particularly targeting urban and suburban youth. It came down through the Bureau of Education, and it was actually funded by Woodrow Wilson with money from the War Department. That's how essential they thought teaching kids about gardening and food production was. The third sort of linked program was something called the Woman's Land Army. And we've all, heard these wonderful, inspiring stories and histories about women land workers. And in World War II, this was a sort of federal program in the US, and it really focused mostly on farm women and equipping them to take over more of farm operations as needed. But in World War One, there was a real edge to it. And the edge was that one of the national organizers of the program was the National Suffrage Party. And they recruited about 20,000 women to help alleviate ag labor shortages. And many of these women were college co-eds, and many of them were from elite educational institutions. And we could have a whole discussion about how they organized themselves under female leadership into labor camps, and they secured for themselves basically labor conditions that eluded their male counterparts for decades. So it's very interesting. So that you've got these sort of programs that are all over the place, targeting people all around the nation. I want to talk to you a little bit about this poster, War Gardens Over the Top. This poster was created by Magnol Wright Barney, Frank Lloyd Wright's sister, who was a noted children's illustrator, a very, very famous illustrator who, like hundreds of famous artists, donated their time to the war effort because World War I was, if nothing else, very much about government propaganda and messaging. And I can look at these posters and go, they're beautiful, they're beautiful. And I agree with some of the messages because they're about gardening, and I'm very favorable to gardening, but really quite scary in terms of control of the press. And things like that. Something called the Creel Commission, the Committee for Public Information, George Creel. There's some really incredible books about the work and how this group of individuals used the sort of modern science of advertising to shift public opinion and control the message. Very interesting, very important. But this poster, War Gardens Over the Top, so it's targeted to kids. It's to get kids to garden. And look at this, over the top. That evokes basically trench warfare, right? And you've got this sort of androgynous child coming over the top of the trench. This is how important and essential this was. So, again, the goals: prevent civil unrest, because America has a history of civil unrest around food. Because it's very dangerous. People get dangerous if they don't have enough to eat. Some of the most interesting food protests were actually during the Civil War. Southern women in Richmond rioting for bread. Alleviate ag labor shortages. The community I live in had a lot of farmers of German descent, and even though farmers had exemptions from the draft, most of the farmers in my community went. And there was an ag labor shortage, and particularly in California, huge ag labor shortage because the US had gotten moody and was trying to ship out Mexican labor, and it was very, very tense. Obviously, feed troops and allies. The US had an enormous draft in World War One. We had a very, very small standing army at the outset. And by the end of the war, we had drafted 3 million men. And we did something that we had not done before on a large scale. We sent millions of men abroad to fight. So things that we accept now, have not always been the same, right? And so we had to feed these troops and we had to feed our allies because Europeans were starving. And so these gardening efforts, what the federal government hoped is that by people producing and eating locally and conserving food, that we could send more of what was produced on farms abroad. There was also a very strong stated intent on the part of some of these organizers that these gardening programs and this sort of movement around gardening, this unified approach, would strengthen democracy and strengthen cities. Really incredibly sort of prophetic idea about the power of gardening. So here we've got a poster, food is ammunition, don't waste it. Imagine if we were doing that sort of messaging around food waste right now, which, we waste so much of our food. I don't have to tell you, but I want you to look at this poster. This is one of my favorite posters, World War One, the last of the old-fashioned wars with cavalry and horse-drawn ambulances, and simultaneously the first modern war with machine guns, right? With disastrous results. Okay, another goal was to, again, to reduce the food mile. And to take the burden off basically railroads so that railroads would be able to ship and move around troops and material for wartime, teach kids about gardening, improve nutrition and health, mobilize citizens, unify a diverse nation. Here's another Maginal Wright Barney piece. Join the United States School Garden Army, follow the Pied Piper. If you look in the background, the landscape is an American flag, and you've got these kids, following Uncle Sam with their gardening implements. The young girl has a military type satchel and she's sowing seeds, a typically sort of female reproductive thing. Okay, there was incredible information produced about gardening. So these free booklets were made available. They were geared to growing regions. This booklet is 32 pages in length, and it's got instructions and tells you, if you want to garden this size, plant this. Here's how you lay it out. Here is how you manage pests. Here's how you build a cold frame. Really informative, taking all this knowledge that was being produced at land grant institutions about, agriculture and gardening, and putting them into these booklets and disseminating them broadly. What's notable about these booklets is that there's a letter in the front of each booklet, in the inside cover, that's a letter from the War Department telling you to garden. It's nuts. Here's a poster for the Woman's Land Army. And so they have these training schools all over the United States. Join the United States School Garden Army. This was a very modern take. I love this poster. It's Edward Penfield. And look at this strong young woman, and she's got bobbed hair, sort of anticipating, foreshadowing the 20s. And it's just beautiful. And here's an actual very poor, um, you know, version of a photo of a member of the Woman's Land Army. Here is another Maginal Wright Barney poster in that series. This program was a big success in World War One, I might add. By 1918, the US was exporting 3 times as much of the sort of essential products to our allies as before the war. Food conservation was a big part of that. And I also want to say, too, that this was a really iconic program in terms of where people gardened. And that's really important, where people garden. So you had these gardens in a lot of public places. There was a demonstration garden in Times Square. There were Liberty, later Victory Gardens on the National Mall. They Boston Common was turned into potato patches by Girl Scouts, and there was also a lesson that I think we could take, which there was an easing of private property law to enable people to grow on easements and to do vacant lot cultivation. And so, you might have Victory Gardens in a railroad easement. Some of the companies, like Eastman Kodak, had literally hundreds of acres of employee gardens, and it actually was identified by many employers in World War One as a way to retain employees, having these great workplace gardens. And so it was really interesting. Um, there was a great story in the Los Angeles Times about a young girl who her neighbor had some vacant land, so the young girl planted beans and then harvested um, a big crop of beans at the end of the season. You could register your war garden. There were criminal penalties if you disturbed or messed with someone's war garden. So very, very different sense about the sort of urgency around these programs. So then we roll into the Depression era. And of course, the Depression hit America's rural area, years before the big, stock crash. And in the Depression era, I don't want to gloss over it. There was a lot of relief gardening. There was a federal emergency relief act that deployed some funds for gardening. There were city relief gardening, efforts. There was a really interesting subsistence urban homesteads model. And, I live in the Los Angeles region, and there are still parts of Los Angeles County where you go and you go, wow, it's a little tiny old house on a huge lot of land. And so I just learned several years ago that it was these home lots were basically set up as part of a federal program during the Depression era. And even as recently as, like, the 1950s, there were like, 8 or 10,000 of these sort of subsistence urban homesteads in the Los Angeles area. So really interesting. And then, of course, Henry Agard Wallace and all that work about, remaking through policy in this era the modern food system. World War II comes along, and America is not the same as it was in World War One. World War One, we were actually a pretty small federal government. By the time World War II comes along, we're a very sort of established state. We've gone through a process of statism, but within several weeks after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Department of Agriculture convened a national conference, a war garden defense conference in Washington, D.C., and brought together dozens and dozens and dozens of groups. And each sort of subcommittee met, and they typed up their recommendations. And I've got the copy of the manuscript, and obviously produced on all sorts of different typewriters and kind of slapped together. But it was really interesting. And some of the people who convened this had participated in gardening efforts in World War One and thought that they were really important and wanted to do them again. And so there were some people in that group that thought were concerned about wasting seed, on urban gardeners. But actually, the World War II Victory Garden program became one of the most iconic homefront mobilizations. World War II. So obviously, they wanted to increase local food production. They wanted to, unifying activity, mobilize people. But one of the big focuses was there wasn't really any concern about lack of food or urban unrest potential. There was really none of that concern. It was about something that the federal government termed nutritional defense, because we had a draft in World War One, we had a draft in World War Two that I think probably 10 million men went through the draft, about 3 times the size of World War One. And when you do a draft, you do a census of male health, and by extrapolation, a census of human health. And what was being seen is that, improvements could be made in Americans' nutritional health. So there was this whole thread of nutritional defense and sort of the obligations of citizens to be healthy, right? And then there was the whole thing, because we're coming off the Depression, about encouraging food preservation and reducing food cost. So this poster is my absolute favorite. I call it the Food Commandments poster. It was used in both World War One and World War Two. Look at number 4: buy local foods. World War One. Okay, local food movement encouraged more than 100 years ago, right? These are rules that we could follow today. Okay, so the result was 20 million gardens in 1943, high production and consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables, and billions of jars of food preserved. And I would also tell you, too, that in the War Industries Board, when they did the War Production Act, there was actually a carve out for steel for basically canning purposes, right? For the kinds of equipment you would need for food preservation. Post World War trends. We go from a regional to a sort of national cuisine. And a lot of that is because of the draft, right? And World War II. And you have this greatest period of sort of movement of American population and immigration, right? With people just like exodus out of some places up to other places for war work, basically mixing it up. And when the military is figuring out how to feed people, maybe they don't understand what Italian food is. And so you get instead nutrition scientists and food scientists create something that's sort of like Chef Boyardee instead, right? And I will tell you that wartime drives changes in food technology. It drives food technology. There are changes in the food system. One of them, primarily being the national highway system. Dwight Eisenhower drove that effort, and it was in part result of his experiences as a young World War One officer who was tasked with testing road readiness by leading a convoy across the United States. There were social changes, right? Women have always been in the workforce, but lots of women going into the workforce. You have also social changes that I think people don't talk about enough post World War II, basically with the GI Bill and how many millions of Americans had access to higher education. And I think, particularly of someone like, my father, who, from a rural community in Mississippi and able, because of the GI Bill, to go to college and get a master's degree and then ends up, living in California. You also have the rise of the suburbs and lawns. So these are things we need to pay attention to. We've had other gardening surges, right? The environmental movement, Earth Day, the Back to Land movement in the 60s and 70s. We had a really wonderful period, and I know people who are from California will remember this, where school gardens were really made a very, very strong presence and resurgence. And we actually had a state superintendent of education who created an initiative of a garden in every school, and which is actually a call back to World War One. Clearly, under the Obama administration, we had nutrition and health policies. We had the wonderful White House garden, which is absolutely beautiful. I've been fortunate enough to go a few times. We also had a USDA garden put in. Tom Vilsack did this called the People's Garden. And if you haven't been there, it's absolutely wonderful. It's right there outside Organic Garden on the National Mall. And now we have this pandemic and other drivers. And I can't tell you what a busy year it's been for me. Um, you know, uh, and watching what's going on, not just in the United States, but globally with this interest in gardening and all the reasons that people are gardening and what the pandemic has shown us about the potential of the food system to be disrupted, the vulnerabilities, the if you had told me a year ago that people would understand um, how meat packing works, um, and would understand the plight that workers faced, I would have been shocked. But now we've seen, in the way that those are structured as workplaces, the spread of COVID-19 through the wonderful work of Leah Jackson, her wonderful investigative reporting, and others. And so I think that there's a lot more awareness about disruption and inequities along the supply chain. So I think as we move forward and reimagining, we need to garden. We need to be really radical and intentional about this. And a big part of it is providing access to land and space. People don't have that. I mean, it's a privilege to have a place to garden. We need to also provide space for meaningful conversations and be inclusive, and collaborate, because this is going to look different in every community, and we need to talk about that. We need to provide education and technical support, but not dismiss the incredible knowledge about gardening that is resident in communities. And we also, I think, need to think about the role of community based organizations, including faith communities. There is the Episcopal Church nationally has started a garden initiative called Good News Gardens. And when I look at the churches in my community, a lot of them have space, and they don't have enough people on the space. And clearly, right now, we're not getting together because of social distancing, but we need to use this time. The way that you might, you know, plant bulbs, and you wait and you wait, but you wait and you tend, and use this time. Some of the ideas I have are encouraging a garden ethos at all levels. Where we garden is important. And I'm a big advocate for seeding public spaces and putting gardens, food production gardens, in really visible places, at seats of government, at public schools, places where people can see them. One of the oldest gardens in my community is was there even in World War One. It's at Lincoln Elementary School, which used to be called Ann Street Elementary School. We renamed all of our schools Washington and Lincoln and Roosevelt in the 30s and 40s. And they have had at this school a continuous garden going since World War One. And in World War One, those kids at that school at Ann Street Elementary in Ventura raised 3 tons of potatoes and depressed the local market. Raised 3 tons of potatoes in their school garden. That school garden is on the main street. You drive down the main street and you see that school garden. We need that. And again, be radical and intentional. We need to make nutrition a national priority, particularly childhood nutrition. It is unacceptable that we have hunger in this country. We are a food abundant nation. We need to, I think, reconsider food acquisition policies for public institutions to coordinate our local food shed. This is our little tiny church pocket garden a couple of years ago. I think we need to take a hard look at food policies and consider restructuring the USDA and look at some of the sort of inherent conflicts at housing certain programs together. And I think that we need to leverage assets. And so when I think of what that would look like, to me, that's something like the USDA is actually the fountainhead for master gardener programs in the US. If you go to the USDA website, within 3 or 4 clicks, you can be at your county's master gardener program. So, what if there were a directive, from the USDA that master gardeners would explicitly support these sort of school, home, community garden efforts, right? I mean, a lot of the programs do it anyway, but if there was some sort of explicit direction, and Tom Vilsack has come back to us as USDA secretary, and I think one of the things that Tom Vilsack showed himself very willing to do during the Obama years was to provide some resources for gardening efforts, right? I mean, he did that People's Garden at the USDA. He did a lot of sort of community food security work. So I think that there's potential there. So a big one for me is encouraging the adoption of a spiraled curricula in the US that emphasizes food, gardening education, nutrition and healthy lifestyle, environmental and food justice, climate change, and sort of embedding that so that people are learning throughout their lives about these issues and that everyone knows how to garden. So, one of the things, I write a lot about Abraham Lincoln, and I have such mixed feelings, as I get older and I know more and learn more about injustice, such mixed feelings about it. But one of the things that I I really appreciate that he said was in 1859, he told a group of Wisconsin farmers when he was stumping, um, and paraphrase that as long as Americans knew how to cultivate land, any size plot of land, that we would be free from oppression of all kinds, including the oppression of kings and moneylenders. And I think that educating people how to produce food is a basic thing and it's something that everyone ought to know. And so I would say I'd love to advocate for an initiative, a creation of a national initiative that encourages all of these school, home, community, and workplace gardens. I don't think we should call it a victory garden program. That to me is a backward looking frame and model, and maybe we don't have to call it anything. Let communities decide what to call it. The important thing is that we support it and that we make it possible for people to create the kinds of gardening programs in their communities that make the most sense. So I'd love to connect with you. I have a book out. It's really a good book and it's got a lot of things in it. It's not just past, there's a lot of present stuff. It's got some terrific stuff about suffrage. I think you might like it. I hope you'll consider taking a look at it. Your public library has a copy, independent booksellers, Amazon. So, anyway, hope you'll take a look. I hope that you'll connect with me. I'm very active on social media. I blog. You can connect with me on Twitter at Victory Grower. I also curate content for the University of California at UC Food Observer. I'm on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn. I have a website. I'm friendly. I will respond to any and all communications. And I am so happy to have had an opportunity to share this stuff with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Rose. We're just see if people will light up the Q&A, and if they come in, I'll read them off to you.
Mike, we do have one question in the Q&A already.
Oh, okay.
So this is from Gary. He wants to know, is there a website that has copies of the Victory 1919 War Gardening booklets that can be downloaded?
Yes, there are, Gary. And I don't know the best way to get those links to you. I can try to drop them on Whova later today.
There's another question, and actually I asked this, Rose, I asked you this before we started, and that was, how did you get into the field originally?
Okay, so how I got into the field originally is really weird. After spending the early part of my career in technology field, I went to work for Cooperative Extension as a 4-H advisor. My mentor was Dan Desmond, who some of you may know, who's nationally known for his work in garden-based education. At our first meeting, he said, Rose, if you want to be successful in 4-H and in your community, do garden-based education, because you will hit science, you will hit collaboration, social learning, you will hit health and nutrition. So I took off with that. I embraced his advice. And then I was sharing with these folks before the presentation started that gardening was a gateway to the larger food system. And I just started learning more. And I started out in 4-H, ended up also taking on a master gardener program, and then started doing sustainable food systems work. And I will tell you something too. I didn't get my PhD until much later in life, and the reason that I got my PhD in history, I'd always been interested in history, but I found a obscure article about the United States School Garden Army, written by a librarian named E.O. Davis in Texas. And I actually went and got my doctorate and my master's and doctorate in US history so I could specifically research the history of these gardening programs.
The question is, can you talk more about the context of Black and Indigenous struggles for access to land at the same time that Victory Gardens were being promoted for, it seems like, white communities, or in World War II for Japanese farmers as well being interned?
Yeah, so I have to tell you, that's one of the reasons that I don't think this frame of Victory Gardens is a good one. And so, in terms of Black Americans and Victory Gardens, Black Americans were very active in the Victory Garden movement. And in fact, I think that Black communities had an incredible amount of knowledge. There is some reporting. My research didn't delve into that, but there is some historical reporting that Victory Gardens actually in some communities were a point of integration. I have, there isn't much that I can say about the internment of Japanese farmers, because, right, I mean, those farmers, particularly in California, they were producing a lot of these fruits and vegetables, and then they are seized and imprisoned, and so, and that was not really spoken of, right, about the impact that that had on fruit and vegetable production. And so again, I think that there are some useful things that we can take from these ideas, but moving forward, these kinds of efforts not only have to be inclusive, but they have to be created in ways by the community that reflect the community. And again, land access is absolutely central to all of this.
Okay, a lot of questions pouring in. The next one in my list is World War I and II gave a clear motivation to promote gardening. Any thoughts on how we can motivate people now and how we can encourage our government to help coordinate these efforts?
Okay. I think that the way to motivate people now is, people garden for many different reasons. Some people garden to educate their kids. Some people garden because it's therapeutic. Many people garden because they want to produce food and to preserve food. And so I think the idea is to just, you know, present the range of possibilities and reasons and meet people where they are in terms of gardening. I know that a lot of people in my neighborhood started gardening more because they got freaked out about some of the disruptions early in the pandemic when they couldn't get things at the grocery store. And in terms of how I think we get the federal government on board, I think that this is just a million people writing to Tom Vilsack saying, can you get on board with some sort of national initiative that supports this? And again, not necessarily top down, but the federal government does have resources that can be brought to bear. And I think that another thing that I think we have to get back to is the idea of encouraging and recognizing the civic and community nature of gardening and the collective good.
Okay, here's another meaty question. In reference to access to land for gardening, please address the issue of lawns and yards versus gardening. That's one. Please address the issues for providing gardens for urban/inner city. That's two. And please address the social phenomenon of sheltering at home, quote unquote, reducing social events that has given rise to the rise of interest in gardening. That's three.
Okay, so lawns and yards. I don't want to tell people what they have to do. The older I get, the less grass I have. And the more I have gardening space or, landscape that is going to be in my area um, conducive to conserving water and attracting pollinators. And also, that's going to make my home safer in the event of a wildfire, which my community is very high risk of. And so, those are my concerns. But I have to tell you, nothing makes my heart soar more than seeing front yard vegetable gardens when I walk around my neighborhood, and I see many more of them since the pandemic. So I think part of it is, shifting larger social understandings of yards and instead raising benefits. There are many groups in my area near Los Angeles that actually will come and reduce or remove your yard and put in raised beds for you. So I hope that answers that okay. In terms of gardens in urban areas, I think that there are lots of ways to do that. And again, I think looking at institutions that are there, not only public places, but churches and places like that, and what kind of space do they have? Is there opportunity for vertical farming and gardening? Is there an opportunity for rooftop gardening? And again, I think that that really depends on the urban area, but I think it's important to create community places for people to have an allotment in a community setting so that they can come together and garden and have space. In terms of the social phenomenon, I think again, I have talked to literally hundreds of people this year about gardening, and people are gardening for so many different reasons. And I think that this feels very different to me than some of the other gardening surges that we've had in the past. I think this is going to be much more lasting. This has been a traumatic event for people, right? This pandemic and all the things that have sort of fallen away, all the things that I think more people are seeing about the vulnerability and the potential for disruption. I'm certainly hearing a lot from people who are gardening sort of as an effort to be more self-sufficient.
Thank you. I think we're going to run out of time before we run out of questions, but let me just continue. We've got a couple more minutes.
Mike, if I can, I want to make sure that
Go
we
ahead,
get
Ashley.
I want to make sure that we get our Huva question in here too.
Okay,
We
go
do have
ahead.
a question that was asked while you were presenting, Rose, and it says, doesn't the National Farm to School Network currently isn't working towards this initiative? And I'm not sure what this initiative means, but just in generally, can you talk about the Farm to School Network?
Well, I think the National Farm to School Network has done an amazing job always. And I think absolutely this is a high priority for them. Absolutely. Amazing organization.
Thank you so much, Rose Hayden Smith, for being here to present. That was wonderful.
Thanks. You guys have a great day.
You too.
Thanks, Rose.